Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Tekin Süleyman, who is a software engineer, speaker, and currently founder of the Join Together Cooperative. Tekin joins us from Manchester, England, in the United Kingdom. Tekin Süleyman, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Quite a broad topic, that one. I think fundamentally it probably comes down to software that is easy to change. One of the things I've been reflecting on most recently is how we shape our software so that it's appropriate, so it's the right fit for the team that has to do the maintaining itself, and making sure there's a good balance there between the shape of the software and the shape of the team.
Can you tell me more about that? Like, can you give me an example? Is that like an octagon type of shape, or?
So more like, if I think about, so at the moment I'm working with a small team. It's our own venture. There's a group of 4 people called Join Together Cooperative, and we build software for unions. And at the moment, we're effectively 2 developers that is writing the software, maintaining the software, have to look after the whole system. We spend a bunch of time with the clients as well, understanding their needs and how it all operates. And it's become quite obvious to me how we're very careful about what we take on in terms of complexity, in terms of features, dependencies. And part of that is because we are such a small team, and thinking about how we keep the shape of things such that a small team can continue to look after that piece of software and continue to grow that software over the long term. We don't have any intentions to grow anytime soon. So yeah, it's kind of something that struck me more recently, and specifically around making sure that we're working in a way that's sustainable over the long term.
When you think about this, I've recently been thinking a lot about how teams they'll make a lot of decisions as they're growing, and that will kind of like, well, we're growing, we've been growing, we're continuing to grow, the product seems to be growing, we're going to be a bigger team in the future, so we need to make this, so we can make decisions under that assumption. And even knowing that maybe, and I often think, well, we forget that we often will start to make teams smaller in the future. Teams will get smaller ideally. Maybe in the future, we don't need to keep exponentially growing the team. But if you're talking about another scenario where you're early on intentionally deciding, no, we don't need to, is it a matter of you don't want to be, or is it you don't think you need to be? Like, how are you making that decision amongst yourselves?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think, we are a new business and we're trying to get to a sustainability financially. And part of that, the reality of that is we aren't going to be able to afford to take on more developers anytime soon. And it's partly that, not wanting necessarily to grow the team anytime soon. And also thinking about that thing around sustainability, making sure that we're able to work and develop the features without getting ourselves to the point where stress, burnout, all the rest of it starts to kick in.
I can appreciate that. So when you're working with those, say, self-inflicted constraints, I suppose, you're saying, okay, we're going to keep it small team, and we're going to make decisions about, like you mentioned, things like dependencies, or just how many different features and functionality you're going to be able to offer to your end users for the tools that you're building. I'm assuming that must be an interesting conversation between you and the people you're working with. Be like, well, wouldn't it be cool if, or wouldn't it be great if we could do all these things? And you're like, yeah, but we can probably only support this. And when you know that as software developers, we have this thing, we can probably build about anything. So how do you kind of like navigate those conversations with your end users and set expectations?
I guess, we are lucky in that because we are such a small team, we're able to make those kind of trade-offs in terms of what features we're going to develop and what we're going to kind of leave on the shelf. Obviously understanding our users' needs, our customers' needs, and delivering on those specifically, and keeping it focused on the core proposition of the product itself. Obviously, this is very different to, say, a startup where, you might be venture funded. You're going for a different sort of growth trajectory. I've consulted before I was working for Join Together. I consulted for many, many years, and I've seen different ends of the spectrum, so to speak. So obviously, if you're a startup you have your funding, you've got your runway, and you're trying to find that product market fit, there's a different dynamic at play. And yeah, those trade-offs aren't as easy to make. I can appreciate that.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus, they're certified ISO 27001, and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. One of the topics I was looking forward to speaking with about is I know that you were involved in the GovUK project. The UK being the United Kingdom, for anyone not sure what that means. I'm assuming most people do. But to me, is that, having seen that from afar across an ocean and a whole country, the landmass from far away, knew a couple different people that were involved in that, but it sounded like a really massive undertaking. So can you paint a picture of what it was like to be part of such a large digital transformation? What were some of the kind of challenges that you got to be involved in, and any breakthroughs that you might have encountered?
Yeah, no, the whole birth of GovUK was really, really cool to see happen. And I'm proud I was able to be a part of that whole process. It started off as an attempt to try and kind of rationalize the UK government's digital real estate. They had hundreds and hundreds of different websites. All the departments and arm's length bodies would have their own CMSs, their own ways of organizing their content. And it was obvious that this wasn't meeting the needs of the UK people. If somebody wanted to know a particular piece of information, how something worked, where they would go to find something about, where to renew their driver's license or how they apply for a fishing license. It was just all over the place. And not only was the project conceived as a way to kind of rationalize that and bring it all under one domain, so all the information was in one place, but the way that it was developed using agile techniques, all the code is open source. You can go to /alphagov on GitHub and you can see all the code there. Most of it, good chunks of it, is written in Ruby on Rails. And there was a period of a couple of years where one by one all the departments were brought into the GovUK system, a big kind of CMS that holds all the content, and beyond the kind of the 50 odd government departments, then hundreds of other arm's length bodies, bringing it all out into the same system, the same domain, organizing the information in a really easy to navigate and searchable way, and then rolling out the digital services alongside that for things like passport applications and all the rest of it.
Kind of browse some of the repositories over time. And, there's a lot of things like design patterns that they're able to kind of use across projects. Like, here's how forms should look when it's part of the design system for the government there. It's a bit interesting to see that from afar, because I'm just like, that just sounds like it would be such a difficult thing for us to do in the United States with how we tend to lean on a lot of privatized development and things like that, and they're all competing with each other. I'm curious, with thinking through that sort of project, was there kind of more of like a monolith kind of core type of thing, or was that something that broke up into a lot of like microservices? And do you think that works well in that scenario? And are there things that you did there that you would definitely not do maybe in a smaller scenario like what you're working on in your current engagement?
So the core of GovUK itself, a lot of the content on GovUK, so if we're ignoring all the separate services, that is made up of a small number of apps. There was a bit of a split between there's one main monolith, which serves a lot of the content, or did at the time when it was built. A lot of the content was served, and the CMS was effectively managed through a single monolith. There was a couple of other applications for some of the separate content that needed to all be organized separately. But for the most part, at least, it started as a monolith. While I was there, we made the transition. Once the bulk of the work had been done to get all the content and all the websites unified, we then started some of the work to try and break that up. One of the technical issues that we had was the monolith had got really big. If you can imagine the data model to organize and kind of represent all the information within government, the departments, the different types of content, translations, all the rest of it. It was quite a complex data model, but also a complicated CMS to kind of manage that. But actually viewing the content was relatively straightforward. You had URLs with mostly static content on them. And the architecture at the time, you had this same quite large monolith, so acting as both the back-end administrative part that was used by civil servants, and the same app was being used to serve the content to the wider public. That wasn't particularly efficient, and there was an inflection point where there was a transition that was made to start to pull out effectively, not necessarily microservices, but it was re-architected such that a separate government front-end application was developed that could read content that was being managed by the CMS. And that was a really cool little project where we kind of used JSON schemas to kind of specify the formats of the content and have the CMS share the content into a content repository, and then the front-end app was able to read those back out again.
Not too dissimilar to something like maybe a static site generator type of kind of evolved into that at some point. But potentially there's a lot more dynamic things involved, especially with things like searching and cross.
Yep. Searching, versioning, all the rest of it. Yeah.
Sounds complicated. In prepping for our conversation, we've talked a lot about version control. And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit. And actually, just before we hit record, I was on my treadmill this morning going for a short walk before I walked up to do the interview. And I was watching one of your talks from, I think it might have been like maybe 2018 on version control related topics. I think it was at a RubyConf or something. And so specifically, how do you think about what value is in version control? Because we talk a lot about maintainable software, like, think about the code side of that, but then there's kind of in that talk, you had referenced something, there are scenarios where projects switch the project management tool, information goes away. And so what's your approach to thinking about what's important when it comes to the granularity of a git commit versus just what sort of details you store in the code versus in your project management tools or your pull requests?
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that's close to my heart. I think it's probably come about partly through having been a consultant for many years and having worked on both project-based teams where, for some of the government services, you'll be working in a team for a few months, and then you'll probably be handing that project over then to somebody else to maintain. But also with startups from the early stages right through to, code bases that are 10 years old. And one of the things that it kind of struck me was how easy it is to lose that institutional knowledge that a team gains whilst they're developing a piece of software. I think I referenced it in the talk that there's a paper by Peter Nauer. It's quite an old one now. In 1985, I think it was written, called Programming as Theory Building. And it's this idea that the software that gets written, the artifact of the code, isn't actually the most valuable asset. It's actually, that's obviously it's very useful to be able to have running code, but actually more valuable is the knowledge that's gained by the team that's developed that software over time, the institutional knowledge, the information that got them to where they have that piece of software and how it's evolved over time. And, when that team is disbanded or the people leave, that knowledge gets kind of lost to the wind if you're not careful. And for me, I feel like the revision history and being careful about how you organize your commits and what information you can capture in your commit messages is a really powerful way of capturing some of that institutional knowledge so that it's there for the future developers to find and to search through.
Why do you think it's so difficult for some developers to wrap their head around writing more than a few words in a Git commit message? Is that just a team process thing, or is it, you brought up shaping a commit message, or what you might include in there?
Yeah, I think there's lots of layers to this. I think there's not a simple answer. I mean, I can definitely go through some of those. One reason is that especially when you're relatively new, you're a junior developer or you're earlier in your career, you probably spend a large portion of your mental capacity getting the code to work, right? The first aim is to get to working code, and that takes up a lot of thought and a lot of energy, and it can sometimes be a messy process to getting to working code. You try this, you try that, you keep poking at it until something works. And I think the act of getting to working code, if you don't take your time to think about how you're going to get there, writing atomic, focused, small commits with nice, neat messages is much harder after the fact. So I think one of the reasons certainly is if you want to be able to write to give a really simple example, trying to split up, structural changes from behavioral changes. You want to refactor a piece of code before you kind of make the behavioral change. And that's a really neat way to split up some commits. So maybe you're going to move a method. This is a really simple example. You move a method, but you're also going to rewrite that method. Your first commit moves it. Your second commit then makes changes to the method, because then that allows you to, firstly, the diff is then much simpler. much easier to reason about, which is going to be great for the person that's reviewing the code, but it's also then going to be there, and it allows you to write a much clearer message about what you've done and why you've done it specifically. I think that's one reason. Another reason is that Git as a tool, it's very powerful, but the user interface is not the most friendly. Tools around Git have got much better. Good IDEs have great support for doing different things, like partial staging of changes and all the rest of it. But I think the fact that the UI, the primary UI on the command line isn't great, doesn't help. And the UI and the experience for doing things like rebasing, reshaping commits, that can sometimes be a bit fiddly. So, I think I like to say that getting good at writing automated tests, that's something that takes time, and you develop your skills at writing tests over the course of your career. I think the same can happen with Git. If you invest a bit of time in learning to Git, learning the tools, learning the commands, you can start to improve how you use it to shape a useful history.
You bring up a good point around early on in someone's career, just trying to get the thing to work, and let alone to be able to always to map out exactly the process that they're going to go through to introduce something. You want to encourage that, they can map it out. So in a way, they might be able to actually draft out what their commit messages could be, maybe make a mental model of what that could look like. Well, this is what I'm going to do. Here's the steps I'm going to follow, and here's the checkpoints along the way that I'm going to kind of air quoting save my progress. But we also know that you're fiddling around trying to debug things, figure things out, and half the time you don't remember how you got there, what rabbit holes you went down, and then you get to the point where you can also overcommit in a way that you're just like, what was I doing? And that can make messy to clean that up later. I've seen a lot of junior developers just try to scrap it and just save all their files, and they'll repaste it again. And I'm like, well, that's an approach to kind of, organizing a good commit message. So when you get that pull request phase. So when you think about details that you would include in a Git commit message, I often also think that some people, if they're not working in a team that has established an alignment there, this is what we think it looks like a good commit message versus also pull requests. You can see templates for that, but I don't see that quite as often. Maybe, at least my personal experience, I haven't seen that as often in the commit message level outside of make sure you include the Jira ticket number or whatever. What sort of details do you think is useful to put in a Git commit message versus, say, a pull request? Or is that depending on just the team's agreement?
I like to think about the valuable information, mostly it's about the why and the value that's going to be there for the developers in the future around the decisions that were made and why they were made. Our software is constantly changing. We're constantly getting new information, making decisions and kind of adjusting behavior. The why is really key. More recently, I guess, because I am working in a much smaller team, we do pair often, but not always, and the software is relatively new, I'll often be writing my commit messages as almost like a commentary to my colleague who's going to be reviewing the code. And so it serves that purpose of giving them the narrative as they're going through, answering the questions that I'm assuming they may have about some decision I've made. I think that can be a really useful way to frame it, to think, okay, well, I know so-and-so is going to review this. Let me just give them a bit of a running commentary without going overboard. You don't want to put war and peace into commit messages, ideally, if it's not necessary. But I think going back to the original thing you were talking about, where it can be sometimes hard to think about how you break things down and getting to a messy place where and then maybe you want to scrap it and start again. I think actually that is a really valid way to do it. You'll have learned a whole bunch. You'll have understood the problem more. And yeah, it might feel a bit silly to throw away the code, but you're probably going to be able to then, layer it up and build it in iterative steps much, much quicker than, you've effectively done your tracer bullet, you've done your prototype of where you think you're going to get to. And I think it can even come before that as well. If we've got a feature to build, that feature can also have its own iterative steps to releasing it, right? If you can think about what is the thinnest possible version of that, how can I make a pull request that's as small as possible? And then breaking that down into smaller steps becomes much easier. And then you can iteratively build on that feature, add the next pull request. So yeah, I think some upfront time to think about how you might break down the larger task, and then within that, getting the small steps to get there. I mean, sometimes it's not even clear what the first step needs to be. And if it isn't super clear, then just, maybe see if there's something you can refactor in the area of the code you're in, or something that's obvious that needs tidying up. Yeah, the whole thing around pull request size, I think, is also really important, trying to keep the size of any particular, not only just the individual commits, but the overall size of the pull request. I think there was another study done where they discovered that anything above 400 lines of code is more likely to end up with bugs than less than 400 lines of code. So I think their thinking was 400 lines of code is about as much code that someone can review in 1 hour. And if they've been reviewing it for more than an hour, they're going to miss stuff. They're not going to be as thorough. I think the actual study itself, there's definitely holes you can poke in it. I think it's probably very language dependent, very framework dependent. But I do think the idea that you should try and keep those units of change, not only the commits, but the pull request itself, small-ish, package it up in such a way that someone can review it quickly, then you're more likely to catch the bugs before they happen. You're more likely to then deliver value quicker as well, which is really important. And you can iterate from there.
We'll be back with our interview with Tekin in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers in Slack, LinkedIn, social media, what have you. Take a picture of it, put it on your Instagram, post a TikTok. This is one of my favorite podcasts, or this is one of the worst podcasts I listen to. Maybe write a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. You know the drill. Also, is there someone you think I should have on the podcast? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview with Tekin Süleyman. That reminds me of something that I've observed on some teams, even with my own team as well, is there's been some aim to say, let's have smaller pull requests. But then I've seen this other sort of weird thing pop up where sometimes teams can get bogged down because now there's some interesting dependencies on like an order of how pull requests need to kind of like, okay, we broke this thing apart, but this can't really get merged into main and get deployed until this other PR is. And then you have this like dependency of like, well, because we were trying to make it smaller, we have these kind of units in there, but there is a little bit of an order there because some data model stuff needs to get pushed out first before this thing can get merged. And now you're orchestrating all these like kind of PRs and stuff, which maybe that can be managed on like maybe more on the ticket level about like these are the dependencies and stuff like that. But it's just something I've observed with some teams trying to like hop through some hoops there.
I've definitely seen that as well. And I think that often happens where you're trying to do lots in parallel. You've kind of over parallelized the work, and ideally you want to try and avoid that so that you don't have the situation where, pull request A depends on pull request B, and which can be hard when you've got larger teams. You're trying to do more software. You want to be able to parallelize that work, but it can almost be a double-edged sword sometimes, coordinating those things.
You only have so many staging or QA environments. Can't push that out until these other things get approved. Pull that out, swap it out. A lot of fun things because we don't just have infinite resources over parallelized. That's a thing. I'm thinking about, when it comes to things like technical debt and the things that build up over a period of time, when you're working on new software, are there strategies you've seen early on that allow you to avoid some things that, do you feel like having worked on some of those projects for a long time, especially in the consulting space or what have you, where those are 10-year code bases and you see what came of a lot of early on decisions, do you feel like that's helped inform how you think about starting projects earlier on in the process?
I guess it always depends on the type of the project. If it's, like some of the project teams that I've been on where it is very much we are delivering this thing, for a government department, there's usually a relatively, not necessarily fixed scope, but there is an outcome that's needed versus say a startup that's trying to find product market fit, has got to iterate fast, has got to meet users' needs, customers' needs, and try and find what that balance is. From what I've observed, when you're in that startup mode, you've got your runway, you've got to get the customers on board, you're iterating quickly. Those early stages, you almost have to push some of these design decisions down the track because you need to deliver that value to make the business viable. If you spend too long agonizing over the architecture and your design, you might run out of money and the business goes under. So, I've seen the situation where startups have pivoted and changed so much, and all of the scars are there in the code base. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Those decisions were made and the business ultimately gets to success through those trade-offs. One of the things I think is much harder is the transition from that early phase, rapid, let's cut corners, let's go quickly to meet the needs of the market, find product market fit, to a more sustainable way of developing, to thinking about the trade-offs that are being made. I think in those early stages, it's kind of almost inevitable that the technical debt that's taken on is kind of unconscious. It's not a decision that was made. In my mind, when you talk about technical debt, it's a conscious decision. You're saying, okay, we want to deliver feature A, and we think we need to do it. We need to model it like this. That's going to take a month. The business says, oh, we've only got 2 weeks. We need to ship it for this date. So you say, okay, well, we will take on the technical debt. We'll cut these corners. We will avoid some of the design choices that will make it take longer consciously and take on that debt with the knowledge that we will meet that deadline. Hopefully, you then have the time afterwards to come back and resolve that and say, okay, once we've met the needs of the market, we can come back and pay down some of that debt. One of the problems I've observed is as startups grow and they start to find their product market fit and they start to kind of stabilize, have more teams, it's a bit of a mind shift to then go, okay, now we need to, every new feature we add, we need to consider the cost of that feature. We need to consider the cost of not considering the design decisions we're making or the technical debt we're taking on. So I think it's really important to start to make that transition and be more conscious about choices, about taking on debt, and also even just about the features that you develop, because ultimately any new feature you add, obviously it's an asset. It's a new thing that your customers are going to be using. Hopefully they need it. Lets you sign new customers, but it's also something you then got to maintain ultimately. It kind of doesn't end at the point you ship it. There's a good example from a team I've worked with not so long ago where they had this need to release some reporting functionality for the product they had, and they built this beautiful feature for reporting all the data about sales and where stuff went. And it was a really nice project to work on because it was quite decoupled in some ways from the main app. It was almost like not quite greenfield because it was still using the same data as a source, but it was set up almost like a separate thing. The data was being fed through to the reporting tool, and it was amazing. But ultimately then, as the rest of the business continued to evolve, as the rest of the data models continued to evolve, suddenly there was a new dependency. You had to keep the reporting function updated as well. So that longer term cost of maintaining the software, of keeping it running, it's almost like you have to consider that and think about what is going to happen once that feature is bedded in, and everything else is dependent on it.
It gets tricky, and you think about the whole walking through that life cycle of a very typical startup scenario where for the ones that succeed, because there's a lot of them that don't. And probably, I don't know what the statistics are on that, but my own anecdotal experience is a lot of startups don't make it. And they try. And so there was always an interesting thing to make that transition to then inheriting projects later on in my area of consulting, where we usually work on projects, 10 years down the road. And you're like, okay, how did we get here? Be empathetic to the previous developers, understand they had interesting constraints at the times. They were trying to ship something. They didn't know if this thing was going to be a thing for more than a few years, right? And then you have other new projects, like you brought up, like the GovUK scenario, where this needs to happen. This is something that's being invested in. There is a very obvious market. This is the path forward. I mean, the project could get pulled for whatever reason, but it's not because it's not going to be useful, right? It's more of this needs to happen. And so you can make some of those bigger architectural decisions early on. Sometimes I wonder if it's people don't go into those scenarios understanding the distinction there. I'm on a project that I'm supposed to do the best job. I'm supposed to use all the theory I learned and maybe got educated in this computer science or what have you. You read all these articles on the internet or watch YouTube videos or go to talks and people this is the way you're supposed to do it. But then you're but it seems like my team is cutting a bunch of corners and they don't care about this stuff, and that starts to erode. Well, if they don't care, I don't care anymore. And then so how do you, for those listening, if they find themselves in the scenario oh, this thing, actually I'm working on a project that still feels like we're working like an early stage startup and cutting corners, but we need to make some shifts. What sort of advice could you offer them on how to start rethinking that, or maybe getting some buy-in with their coworkers?
Yeah, it's a really hard thing to deal with. I mean, there's almost like a addictive quality to shipping features, to doing the code, to building complicated technical Lego systems. And sometimes, you can over-index on that. And probably the longer you've been in the game, the more you've seen these old code bases, the more you've felt the pain of those decisions that were made that weren't fully thought through. You start to feel that pain a bit more, and you become more aware of, okay, what can we do today to make this better for the future? I don't know. I think it's a hard one. I don't know if I have a good answer for this question. It's not so much talk. I think it has to be an organization-wide thing. I think the conversations need to happen at all levels about quality, about the pace of change, about sustainability. I think if you have good relationships with everybody involved in the chain, designers, product managers, up to the founders, the salespeople, appreciating that just shipping features at an unsustainable rate is not going to be sustainable in the long term, and you're going to slow down eventually. I think when it comes down to individual pieces of work, I think that's if it's a new feature or a new project you're going to start working on, I think that is often the point to try and address some of the issues that might already exist. And, if there is some, technical debt, or there's some problems with the way something is organized, that's going to mean delivering that feature is going to be harder. Trying to bake in whether it's refactoring or reorganizing, whatever work that needs to happen to deliver that feature, trying to have that as part of the conversation when it comes down to estimating, when it comes down to planning that work, to say, look, we think this feature is going to be delivered best. It's going to be more reliable, more maintainable, more performant, whatever it might be, whatever the characteristics are going to be, if we first do this small piece of work to tidy this up. Often that's the best time to have those conversations and to address those specific issues. Yeah, the culture shift, it is difficult. Like I say, if the business has been in startup mode for the longest time, and those habits will be ingrained in the culture of the teams, it takes a bit of effort and a bit of time to slowly move out of that mode and to think more sustainably about delivering change.
I like that. The thing about it being an organizational thing, and then there's the individual, what can I do? I'm just a developer. Listeners are probably mostly software engineers on a team and of several engineers, and they may feel like they only have so much influence themselves, right? And you've mentioned product managers, things like that, and product owners and other roles that are part of this conversation that needs to be had. I'm thinking about the whole scenario, even product owners will come into an environment where their background is in I worked at a rapid growth startup or something, or they came from an environment that was much more mature software development process, right? And so they're coming with their own understanding of how they've historically been involved in projects. They might be coming into say the thing that they were hired for might be to, hey, help the team unblock themselves, and so we can start moving faster again. And there could be a lot of different ways to make that happen. Or we need to shift, the team's slowing down, or the engineering team is slowed down for whatever reason. All of our new developers seem to be slower than the ones we hired originally in the first couple of years. And I hear this stuff a lot in the consulting space when I'm talking with clients, and it's I don't understand why the team's so slow. They used to be so much faster. Can you help unblock it? I'm I don't think it's going to be just throwing more people at the problem or hiring an air quoting expert to come in. And so it's okay, it's everybody's kind of pointing the fingers why did we make all these concessions earlier on? Why didn't we plan ahead for this? And and it's well, you told us to do this, or I wasn't even part of the team then, and we can't blame that person. And so it's just complicated software development.
Another factor is often that isn't considered, I think, is what's your utilization? Getting back to the sustainability point, I think a lot of the time, especially these early phase startups, there's a sense of urgency and a sense that we need to be always doing more. And what you'll find is that the business is trying to squeeze as much out of the team as possible. And that's where the danger comes in. And actually, I think a lot of the time, that's where the slowdown comes, is when you're trying to do too much parallelization. You're working at capacity. I mean, if you think about a web server, if your web server's operating at 90% capacity, you suddenly have a spike in traffic, everything's going to go down, right? So, you want your web servers at a capacity that's not wasteful, but also has a bit of headroom. And I think it's the same for development teams. Ultimately, you need a bit of slack to deal with bugs that come in, to deal with support requests, to deal with people being unwell, going away on holiday. Those kind of changes always happen. And there's this kind of tendency to think, if we want to do more, let's do more work in parallel. Well, actually, I think often doing less work and trying to do less at once will get you to the results quicker. Because there's less, you don't pay the same cost of context switching, of interruptions, those inevitable things that ultimately slow a team down. So again, it's hard if it's, because it has to be at the organizational level. It's not something that an individual developer can necessarily, that's not something that the change that they can make. But I think, as individuals, we can set good examples in terms of how we structure our work, how much time we take over, organizing the sequencing of the work, how we write our tests, capturing the fact that there's some debt we've taken on. Hey, I've not done this yet, but we need to come back and resolve this issue once this is shipped. That's another thing that often happens is, back-to-back feature shipping. We've shipped the feature on Monday. We're starting work on the next feature on Tuesday, with no headroom to deal with the inevitable bugs and whatever tidy up that might, I think, again, that comes back to the planning phase, thinking early on, all right, here's when we think we're going to, hopefully you're shipping a version early as possible. And then you have time for some iteration, but also to pay down the debt, to fix the bugs. Yeah, these are all conversations that I think can happen within project teams, within delivery teams, to get to a point where delivery can be more sustainable, but also think more about the costs of cutting those corners ultimately to the maintainability of what you're shipping.
Hey again, it's me, Robby. Just want to take a moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. We're a software consultancy that specializes at helping organizations with Ruby on Rails applications make them better and more maintainable. Surprise, surprise. If you work with an organization or maybe previously worked in an organization and you know that they're struggling with technical debt, some legacy code challenges, or struggling to figure out how they can take advantage of new features coming out in the upcoming versions of Ruby on Rails and looking to modernize their platform, send them my way, planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com, and tell them that I sent you. Or tell them to tell you that I sent you. You know what I mean. planetargon.com. Back to our show. I like that. And I appreciate you kind of dig into that. One of the other things that, to kind of touch on with you as well, you hinted at this earlier, was when you're building features for humans, for people, right? And so you're having those conversations, and so trying to understand their needs so that they can make their life and their job, whatever the tasks they're trying to accomplish, hopefully simpler, and software can be an enabler in that way. So how do you think developers might be listening like, well, I don't often get to work directly that close with the users because maybe they're a couple steps away, and their experience is usually maybe sitting in a ticketing system and getting assigned tasks. So any advice for them on how they can start thinking about how they can better connect with the users, even if they're not necessarily, maybe a couple nodes away from the end users?
Yeah, I'm really fortunate. Again, this goes back to the GovUK days, to having worked there, where every project team, every team within GovUK, there'd be developers, there'd be a designer, there'd be a product manager, someone called a delivery manager, which is a bit like an agile coach, I guess, in some ways. But there'd always be a user researcher, and their job would always be to take whatever was being built out to the end user, whoever that might be, whether it's a civil servant using the back-end system or an end user like a citizen that needs to use that service. And they would run these user research sessions where they would say, hey, okay, you've got to perform this task. Here's the software, you do it. And these would get recorded. They would capture their findings. They would do presentations. And I'll tell you, seeing these videos of a user using the software that you've carefully designed, you thought is brilliant, solves the problem perfectly, and seeing people really struggle with that pain of a badly phrased word or a button that's got the wrong label on it, or some usability or accessibility issue, seeing the pain of a real user trying to solve a problem and failing was really eye-opening and really humbling. And so I really do value developers getting to see like the end user actually using the product. I think that's a really important thing. And also being able to have the conversations with the end users to understand the problems more. I think I've never been a fan of where the developer is, like you say, one or two steps removed from the end user, and it's the understanding, the information is kind of filtered and passed down through a BA to a product manager to a designer, and then eventually ends up at the developer. And it's sometimes the developer insight can really help simplify a problem, simplify the solution ultimately, because the spec that you get in a Jira ticket, you can build to that spec and you can deliver it and it's moved across the board and you've great job done. But ultimately having a conversation close to the end user, whether it was even listening in on the conversation, might spark something that makes you think, oh, you know what? We could do it that way, but actually if we did it this way, the solution could be much simpler and we could build something more maintainable. Right through to the ultimate maintainable code, no code at all, like saying, okay, you know what? The user is asking for A, but actually they could just use our export function and do it in a spreadsheet. And that's going to be way more effective than us building this bespoke tool to do whatever. So yeah, I'm a big advocate for developers ultimately getting as close to the user as possible. I think that becomes more and more important as stuff like AI and things like Copilot come in to the frame. I think being able to translate a problem, being able to ask those 3 whys, don't take the first why, keep digging in. Why do you need this? Why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Until you get to the root of the problem they have. Because often the user is going to suggest a solution to you rather than framing their problem in the clearest way and allowing you to say, okay, how about this? Would this work? Would this get you, the outcome that you need? That's
some great advice there. I don't know how many times in retrospect I wish we had just thought, maybe we should have just exported this for us. You can do this in Excel or Google Sheets, and which you already know how to do, and you can do whatever you want in there with that. You can make your pretty charts and you can update the report, and maybe we don't need to maintain this complicated report in the back end that you use once every 6 to 8 weeks, but took us forever to build. And we're still supporting it. I think that speaks to one of your earlier stories there as well, is you have to support it forever. It's hard to take those things away as well. So it's hard to remove features.
But it's good. You should remove features.
Any advice on how to like identify areas that are maybe not being used that much? Or is it just like talking to users or monitoring type, observe, like adding some monitoring into the tool to track what's being used or not?
I don't know if I can speak to specifically to this. It's not something I've necessarily done a lot of myself. Yeah, but that's certainly having some kind of reporting. I'm trying to think in retrospect, there's probably a couple of scenarios where, there's been a corner of the app where we thought, hold on, is anybody actually using this anymore? Do we need this? And then going through the process of monitoring that, contacting anybody that might still be relying on that, telling them that it's going away. I do think there's definitely value in that. Like I said, that I think Avdi Grimm spoke about this a lot previously when he appeared on the podcast, like that capabilities that you add and having the capacity there to then look after the thing in the long run.
I think it's wise to think through that. So if developers, if you're listening and you think you have a hunch that maybe there's some areas of your app that could potentially be removed, maybe look up some explorations on how to do that. Maybe you'll make your life better. A couple of quick last questions for you. Is there a non-programming book that you find yourself recommending to peers in the industry?
No, I wouldn't say there's one in general, but there's a really good one I'm reading at the moment. It's called Palestine Plus 100, Stories from a Century After the Nakba. It's a series of short stories written by Palestinian authors imagining what life will be like in 100 years after the Nakba in 2048. So it's kind of science fiction-y. There's some really eye-opening and moving stories in there, really worth checking out. If you wanted a technical book, one of my favorites that I definitely do recommend is one called User Story Mapping, which is a great book about thinking about how you break down, complex pieces of software into more iterative deliverable steps. That comes back to the whole thing around Git and shipping iteratively.
Nice. I'll include links to that as well for everybody. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online?
So I'm at Tekin on ruby.social. I also have a website where I occasionally blog, not so much recently, but that's tekin.co.uk. There's a newsletter you can sign up for. I probably haven't written anything in a couple of years just because I've been very busy, but hopefully in the near future, I'll start blogging again.
Awesome. Well, definitely have those links in the show notes for everybody. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable Tech. And thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thank you, Robby. It's been my pleasure.